Welcome to today's Mind Your Career webinar program. My name is Adam Sylvain and I work with the Alumni Career Development Team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Beat Impostor Syndrome, Strategies for Career Confidence. Today we'll hear from alumna Caroline Auerkirk. Caroline is a career coach working with young professionals 2 to 12 years out of college to clarify and explore who they are, what they care about, and where they want to go so they can pursue their next step with confidence. Through one-on-one coaching, online courses, and in-person workshops, Caroline is on a mission to help young professionals find fulfilling work that maximizes their talents while creating space for all of their other priorities. Caroline received her AB in History from the University of Chicago and her Master's in Higher Education Administration from the University of Pennsylvania. She also has a certification in creative writing from the Graham School and a certificate from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business Executive Program for Emerging Leaders. You can find her online at www.carolineauerkirk.com. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to cede the floor to Caroline.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adam. I am so excited to be here today. If you've ever felt a wave of worry that you just don't feel like you know what you're doing at work and you're just moments away from being fired, then this presentation is for you. If you feel disconnected or like you're just going through the motions and leaping over whatever obstacles are in front of you today, only to have to do it all over again tomorrow, then you're in the right place. If you've ever decided not to apply for a job because you didn't exactly meet all of the listed requirements, please keep listening. And if you feel successful, but only because you happen to be a likable person who is often in the right place at the right time, then it's definitely time for an infusion of career confidence. Imposter syndrome is incredibly common and affects professionals at every career stage. It's not curable, but it can be managed effectively and go dormant for months or even years at a time, instead of negatively affecting you and your life on a daily basis. I've battled imposter syndrome throughout my career, even including the process of putting together this webinar. As a university administrator, instructor, and now as a career coach, I've helped hundreds of students and alumni of top schools work through feelings of imposter syndrome. I've seen how pervasive imposter syndrome is among highly capable and ambitious people, from some of the most brilliant undergraduate students to professionals at the top of their field with impressive titles and even more dazzling accomplishments. I've also seen the substantial negative impact it can have on your career trajectory and job satisfaction if it's left unmanaged. Along the way, I've combined my insights with the latest research on imposter syndrome, together with my experience as a practitioner working in experiential education and career coaching, to develop a 4-part career confidence framework that combines self-awareness and strategy to effectively combat imposter syndrome and its impact on your life and career. Context is important to me, so a little bit of background before we dive in. As Adam mentioned, I graduated from the University of Chicago with an AB in History. This is a photo of me on the first day of orientation outside of Hull Gate. My BA paper was on the disappearance of grocery stores from the south side of Chicago, inspired in large part by community service work I was doing in Woodlawn with the University Community Service Center. I'll come back to that intersection of theory and practice in a moment. I got my master's in higher education administration at the University of Pennsylvania, like Adam mentioned, and then came all the way back to the University of Chicago for my first job, where I had symptoms of imposter syndrome on an hourly basis. I was 23 and tasked with starting a center on interdisciplinary urban research from scratch at the University of Chicago, the place that invented urban sociology. I was younger than everyone I worked with, and our plans were often shifting, which made it incredibly challenging to figure out if I was on the right track. With the support of fantastic mentors, I gradually grew more confident and spent 4 years at the University of Chicago building up that center, learning how to manage staff and navigate the university. And then in 2015, I moved on to the Civic Engagement Office at Johns Hopkins University here in Baltimore, running experiential community service and social justice programs for undergraduate students, and then also teaching leadership courses through the Center for Leadership Education at the School of Engineering. In 2019, I moved into career coaching full time. As I said, I'm based in Baltimore, but I work remotely with clients around the world. I'm focused on young professionals who are 2 to 12 years out of college, and I coach them one-on-one on overcoming imposter syndrome and developing confidence in their careers as a more in-depth version of what we're talking about today. I also coach clients who are ready to take the next step in their careers and are looking for something that is more fulfilling and more aligned with their skills, values, and interests. Many of my clients have jobs that look pretty good on paper, but they feel like they're going through the motions or are just really miserable. Usually it's because they found themselves in a role where they're doing something they're good at, but they don't actually like to do it. So I coach them through a 3-phase process to clarify skills, interests, and goals, explore possible options, and then make a decision they feel confident about so that they can make a plan to get the best next step for them. As I'm also mentioned, I'm about to launch an online course on imposter syndrome, which covers each step of the 4-part career confidence framework in greater detail, so that you can combine self-awareness and actionable strategy to control imposter syndrome for the long term. The early interest form is open right now and registration will go live next week. So if you find today's webinar valuable and want the space and support to dig deeper, I definitely hope you'll check that out. There will be a discount code for those who show early interest. And now let's dive into the heart of today's presentation. I should mention that in the handout section of the webinar platform, there's a worksheet for you to use to follow along with the content of this presentation. If you happen to be catching this later, or you would like to go further in depth with the material, you can head over to my website to download the worksheet and additional resources I've gathered on this topic. I'm really excited about what I've gathered for you there, and I hope you do check it out. I should also mention, like Adam, I think also mentioned, that at the end of today's presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. So please make a note of anything that comes up for you so we can be sure to address it during the Q&A. Okay, so imposter syndrome is a huge topic and there's so much to cover. So I want to be strategic about our goals for today. Here are some key points we're going to hit. I want you to leave this webinar with a broader understanding of what imposter syndrome is and isn't, how it shows up in everyday life. I'm going to go into in depth about why I think it affects so many smart and ambitious people. We're going to explore the impact it's having on your life, career trajectory, and job satisfaction. And then I'm going to share my 4-part career confidence framework so that you can start mapping out a strategy for managing imposter syndrome for the long term. The worksheet that we have in the handout section gives you a really great graphic organizer to arrange your notes on what we'll cover today. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, I would definitely encourage you to take a moment to do so. This clearly lays out what I'd like you to get out of this webinar. So specifically, I want you to be able to walk away from our conversation today with one example of how imposter syndrome shows up in your life, 2 ways it's negatively impacting the goals you have for your life and work, 3 strategies you can use to mitigate the impact of imposter syndrome. And then I want you to dream big and envision 4 ways your life would improve if you were able to tame the imposter monster. Okay, so now that we've got the agenda and the worksheet squared away, let's dive into part 1, what imposter syndrome is and isn't. All right. So I want to begin by saying that I'm not actually a huge fan of the name imposter syndrome. I know I titled this webinar, but I think it's a problematic term because I think it conjures up a bunch of ideas of people feeling like they're in their jobs with falsified diplomas and made up resumes, waiting to be discovered at any moment. People start to hear some of the other symptoms of imposter syndrome and identify with those. But then this lingering idea of I have to be a fraud to have imposter syndrome starts getting people to the point where they begin to have imposter syndrome about having imposter syndrome, and that's especially unhelpful. So I want to be clear that you don't need an official diagnosis of imposter syndrome. It's just not that important. What's more important is that you start to recognize the broader behavior patterns associated with imposter syndrome and start to see how they might be negatively affecting your confidence on a daily basis at work, in addition to seeing how it can affect your career negatively over the long term. So for some of you, this feeling of playing dress up, like the first image on my screen here, might really resonate with you. You may have a feeling that you just don't belong or that you're just pretending. I see this especially with younger clients who have found themselves in jobs with significant responsibility very early in their careers. They often have a lot of visibility, or they're managing or supervising people who may have decades more of experience than they do. In these cases, imposter syndrome can absolutely feel like you're playing pretend or you're just pretending to be a grown-up. You might spend a lot of effort trying to hide facts about your age or years of experience. You might feel especially self-conscious about appearing young. I know I dressed much more formally than most of my colleagues during my first few years in the working world, and I didn't even wear heels to my wedding, so that was really out of character for me. Imposter syndrome can also look like perfectionism. So this idea that unless everything is flawless, you're somehow unprofessional or not worthy of whatever role you're in. You may spend a lot of effort to make sure your work is perfect, often much more than necessary. We'll come back to this idea of the A++ mentality in a moment. But another common example of imposter syndrome is this idea that you're just floating or you're going through the motions. You're able to do the work, but you feel completely disconnected. You may even find yourself wondering, like, how did I get here? Or like, where am I? Like, how did I end up like this? I see this a lot with very driven, motivated people who have a track record of achievement. So they're so used to clearing whatever hurdles in front of them or whatever obstacles in their way that they rarely stop to ask themselves if they even care about the path that they're on. This is where many of my clients are when they come to me. So they've spent 16 or more years in school doing all the things they're supposed to do, and then they start to realize that they've never stopped to ask themselves if they actually want to be doing what they're doing. Imposter syndrome can also come out in this inability to take ownership over your successes. So you might chalk up landing a new job to the fact that you knew the right people. Or perhaps you're really skilled at being witty or charming or charismatic, and you feel like that's the reason you've been able to be successful, that you're just a person that people like to work with. I heard that exact quote from 3 of my clients last week alone. Hopefully by now you're starting to see that imposter syndrome can present in many different ways, and we could go on, but I'll finish with one final example. Imposter syndrome can sometimes look like an aversion to challenge. So people who are struggling with career confidence have this tendency to avoid situations where there's a potential for failure. We're going to go into this in more detail in a moment, but for now, let's leave it with this idea of avoiding doing things that you might not be good at, whether it's a project at the office or applying for a job when you're not 100% qualified for it or something else. It just leads you to stay within your comfort zone. I'm going to pause here and ask you to take a moment to look at the first box on that worksheet. And again, it's in the handout section if you haven't found it yet. And I'd like to ask you to jot down anything that resonates with you from what we just talked about what imposter syndrome can look like. Okay, so now that we've spent some time exploring what imposter syndrome looks like, let's take a moment to emphasize how common this is. So nearly every article and listicle about imposter syndrome on the internet cites this same statistic that 70% of people experience feelings of imposter syndrome at some point in their careers. And I'd wager to say that's almost certainly higher because of all those people who are worried about whether they even have imposter syndrome in the first place. There are many stories of well-known actors and writers and others sharing stories that sound a lot like the situations we just went over. But the most important thing to realize is that this is a widespread experience at all levels of career and competence. This is a webinar for alumni and friends of the University of Chicago, however, so I want to take a few minutes to talk specifically about why I think imposter syndrome is so common among smart, ambitious people like yourselves. So for one thing, you most likely have a high degree of natural competence. So you might be able to devise a situation or a solution, you might be able to devise a solution to a tricky problem or grasp a new concept really quickly. And then you hear from colleagues or classmates that they're struggling and they find it really difficult. And then you start to worry that maybe you're doing it wrong because you're not struggling. And then you can fall into the spiral of wondering what you've missed. And when in reality, it's just that you're really that your natural strengths have really just put you on this faster track to understanding. Another obstacle you might be grappling with is a fear of failure. So you didn't get into the University of Chicago by failing your way through high school, and that trend has almost certainly continued after graduation. So if success is a key component of your identity, then failure seems incredibly threatening. Of course, many people aren't consciously avoiding failure so much as they are restricting themselves to things that they know that they will be good at and not really testing the limits of their skills. This is especially problematic if you haven't actually taken a moment to assess whether you actually like doing the things that you know you're good at. I see this all the time with my coaching clients, so we usually spend a lot of time mapping this out together. We'll talk about this fear of failure a bit more in a moment, but the key here is to start thinking about whether there are things you know you're good at, but you actually really dislike doing. Another confidence challenge I see with highly intelligent people is that as they become more aware of how much they still don't know, their confidence plummets. So there are psychological studies that have measured this, and it basically comes down to the fact that people tend to be overconfident in their abilities at the beginning and then lose confidence as they learn more. So this chart is an interpretation of the data presented in the study, and this phenomenon is often referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. But regardless of the studies, you've likely seen this anecdotally in a hobby you've tried. The world of Pinterest fails is a great example of this. We begin with confidence. I've got this. This is really straightforward. And then it plummets as we develop a deeper understanding of the complexity of the project, and then it does start to even out once we've got some mastery. Which brings me to my next point, which is that helpful, constructive, actionable feedback in the workplace is uncommon. This can be a significant adjustment, especially for people coming out of school. If you're used to doing work and receiving a grade or other feedback, many workplaces can feel frustrating with their lack of timely feedback on your performance. In many cases, the criteria for excellent performance is vague or hard to assess, or your supervisor might just not know what she wants at all, believing instead that she'll just know good performance when she sees it. This can make employees feel really insecure about their performance and incredibly anxious come performance appraisal time. This dovetails closely with my last point, which is something I haven't seen referenced in any of the literature on imposter syndrome, but since my background is in experiential education, I really think it's important to point out, and I think it's really something that's missing from the conversation on imposter syndrome. So in most formal education, there is a specific set of content that is to be mastered. So there's a curriculum outlining the order in which everything must be learned and how all the pieces connect together. Your syllabus structures the information into discrete chunks. Master this content and you'll progress to the next level, rinse, repeat, and suddenly you're walking across the stage on a sweltering day in June, collecting the most expensive piece of paper you'll ever buy in your life. The challenge is that in a work setting, we usually learn by doing. And when most of us are more familiar with learning by mastering the material, this can be a bit jarring. You might feel frustrated because experiential education is iterative. So on the surface, it might feel inefficient. You've been doing this naturally your entire life. You touch a hot pot, you burn yourself, you evaluate that outcome as less than ideal, and then you decide to do something differently next time, like use a pot holder. Next time, pot holder in hand, you reassess your experience and you determine that the experiment had a better outcome. Now you have a process that meets your goals, plus extra information you can apply in a different setting, like touching something hot outside the kitchen. This is how we learn. It can be summed up in a really cool model called the experiential learning cycle, which looks like this. In a work setting, this can look like doing a big presentation for a client and then afterward implementing new tracking systems so that you don't have to scramble at the last minute to get the data together before the next presentation. We see the same steps here. So doing something like giving a presentation, that's the concrete experience. Making an assessment, it was a giant pain to pull all of the data together at the last minute. Developing a hypothesis, maybe ongoing data collection would make reporting easier. And then implementing. So the process continues, right? You reflect after the next presentation that indeed collecting the data was helpful. And now you have a new idea. What if you automated the data reporting instead of relying on staff to submit the info? Then you can see how that goes for the next presentation and you keep tinkering. People sometimes get frustrated with this process and wonder why they just couldn't have figured it out how to do it the right way the first time. This is often connected to these feelings of imposter syndrome. So if I actually knew what I was doing, I would have been able to figure this out in the first place instead of constantly having to tweak the process. People tend to see this iterative process as a failure or at the very least inefficient. This transition from mastering content to learning from experience can feel really frustrating, and especially for people who've always learned things really quickly. So the one thing I want to emphasize here is that reflection is the most important part of this learning process. You don't automatically just get better by just doing the same thing over and over again, although that does help. But the real learning happens from what we call the meaning making from lived experience. So if you feel like you're making the same mistakes over and over again, consider slowing down and really spending some time processing and reflecting on what's going on so that you can be more intentional about the next iteration. So I've shared with you a couple of situations where imposter syndrome can arise, but the truth is that there are many more situations that can trigger imposter syndrome. As we'll talk about in a moment when we get to this career confidence framework, self-awareness is a crucial component of managing imposter syndrome. And it's why we spend so much time in my online course and in our one-on-one coaching sessions to dig deep and get a really solid understanding of what it looks like for you and where it comes from so that you can more systematically disrupt the patterns of behavior at play. So let's take a minute to dive into imposter syndrome and how it can have an impact on your career growth and job satisfaction. So before I share with you some of the effects I've seen people grapple with, I'd like to invite you to turn to the worksheet for the webinar and jot down 2 examples of how you feel your imposter syndrome is negatively affecting you. And if you haven't downloaded this worksheet or again are watching it later, this is a friendly reminder that you can visit my website to download the worksheet and even more resources on beating imposter syndrome. And it's also in the handout section on the webinar platform if you're watching this live. Great. So now that you've taken a moment to jot down a few examples of how imposter syndrome is making an impact on your life, I'll share a few examples of what I've seen in my experience. So the most common negative effect of imposter syndrome is a failure to take action. So this might be as explicit as just not doing something you know needs to get done, or it might look like procrastinating on something that feels especially challenging. But beyond the consequences of just not doing the thing you were supposed to do or wanted to do, the situation is problematic because it creates an excuse for why something didn't pan out, right? So you're able to just blame your inability to take action. So it's just that you just didn't do it or you put in a suboptimal effort. This brings in the subtle undertone that if you had done the thing or you put in the effort you know it requires, you would have gotten the results that you wanted. So it becomes a convenient way to hedge your fear of failure. This is self-sabotaging behavior, right? But it happens all the time. You're able to create this mental image that success would have been yours if you had decided to go for it. But in reality, your inaction means that you're just completely avoiding the success or the failure in the first place. So failure to take action or feeling stuck or frozen can take other forms too. So in my experience, research is the most insidious form of procrastination. The problem with research is that it feels like you're being productive, and perhaps to a certain extent you are. But the problem comes from spending too much time in the research cycle and never actually moving forward towards action. Like we just talked about, this is an especially common imposter syndrome behavior for really smart people. So research is how you've been trained to approach and solve problems. But like we just discussed, learning from experience is the currency of the working world. So you can feel incredibly frustrated when the solution to your problem isn't in a book. And no matter how tall your stack of books is, this is my husband in the Regenstein Library when we were in college, some things can only be learned from experience. One other very common way people fail to take action is by talking themselves out of applying for jobs and other opportunities, unless they perfectly match all of the qualifications that are listed. I see this all the time, often for jobs, but especially also for things like awards or fellowships and similar opportunities. In so many cases, people decide not to apply because they don't feel like they have a shot at all. But I've participated in so many hiring and awards committees, and I'm always surprised by this. Let me tell you that plenty of other people with much lower quality applications have already applied to whatever you're looking at. Your job is to apply. It's the committee's job to pick the winner. Let the committee reject you. Don't do that work yourself. This ties in with my next point, which is that people who are grappling with imposter syndrome have a tendency to not take ownership over their successes. And they often attribute that success to another irrelevant factor. So sometimes this looks like chalking up success to just being lucky or being in the right place at the right time or knowing the right people, rather than owning the fact that your success is due to the specific combination of skills and experiences that you bring to the table. You may also look at each success as its own discrete accomplishment, disconnected from all of the other successes that you've had in your life. You can imagine yourself jumping over hurdles and tackling each hurdle separately, but in reality, it's your ability to clear the next hurdle is directly related to your skill and experience at jumping through all of those other hurdles in the past. They're all connected. One obvious problem with this is that if you don't take ownership over your success and accomplishments, someone else will. Strategic self-promotion is vital in today's workplace, and you cannot assume that your good work will magically be discovered and recognized. It's vital to accept the credit for your accomplishments and understand how to use strategic self-promotion effectively. So another way that imposter syndrome might be affecting you is if you have the tendency to over-prepare. So whether it's for a presentation, a project, or an important meeting, over-preparation takes many forms, but it's generally characterized by feeling so nervous about your ability to tackle whatever challenge you're facing that you overcompensate by doing far more preparation than what the situation actually requires. The challenging part is that this phenomenon is that over preparation does contribute to your success in the task at hand, which in turn reinforces the idea that the preparation was essential. But in reality, you probably could have achieved comparable results in less time. So finally, one thing that I saw constantly when I worked at Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago is that my students really did not have any perspective about how fantastic they actually were. They were really unable to assess their strengths and skills and on average had the tendency to rate their performance much lower than they should have. So if that's your situation as well, I want to encourage you to just take a moment and recognize how much you bring to the table. And that's so, so, so important. So no matter what your particular version of imposter syndrome looks like, it's important that you can see how it can have significant and lasting effects in your career if it's not managed effectively. From holding yourself back from promotions or other opportunities to not giving yourself an accurate understanding of your contributions, to undermining your self-confidence, and the impact of imposter syndrome is real. So before we move on to the career confidence framework, I'd again like to encourage you to take a moment to write down 2 ways that feelings of imposter syndrome are having a negative impact on your life. Great. So now that we've had the chance to take a deeper look at imposter syndrome, from how it can show up in your day-to-day life to what it feels like to the impact it's having on your career and your confidence, it's time to move on to talking about what you can actually do about it. So we're going to dive into the 4-part career confidence framework. This is a high-level overview of the combination of self-awareness and strategy that I go into much more detail through some of the other offerings that I have. But most of the articles and the books about beating imposter syndrome focus on ideas like fake it till you make it or other tips that, in my opinion, tend to minimize the impact that imposter syndrome might be having on your life. So they also tend to not delve into the substance of why you're experiencing these emotions in the first place. They're also often really skimpy on actual strategies that you can use to deal with the effects of imposter syndrome, both in the moment and over the long term. So this framework works because it combines self-awareness with strategy to develop a plan for battling imposter syndrome that is unique to you. So as you can see, the 4 pillars of the framework are self-awareness, short-term mitigation strategies, long-term confidence building strategies, and community building. So you'll notice on your worksheet that there is a place to list some of the strategies that resonate with you. But of course, there are many, many more techniques and strategies than we have the time to cover right now. So feel free to add in others that you can think of, or things that have worked for you in the past, or sort of other inspirations that you have. So let's start with the first part of the framework, self-awareness. So the self-awareness component of the strategy involves getting a deep understanding of your unique version of imposter syndrome. So I know we kind of went into this idea earlier of having imposter syndrome about having imposter syndrome, but for this part, I really want you to focus on understanding how imposter syndrome shows up for you, what it sounds like, what it looks like, and where it comes from. So what are the root causes of this for you? This is also a time to focus on getting a deeper assessment of your skills and strengths and values, this personal self-awareness of what you contribute, so that you have a more realistic understanding and awareness of what you bring to the table. Since as we discussed, people with imposter syndrome often struggle with understanding their unique contributions and strengths. So if you really do some strategic work on figuring that out for yourself, you can really feel more prepared and have a better understanding of what you do, what your strengths really are, and then also what your shortcomings are. So rather than kind of extrapolating that into the distance and really imagining it, you can actually develop some really clear data on what this actually looks like for you. So also in self-awareness, we're talking about getting a deep awareness of the impact that imposter syndrome is having on your life and your progress towards your goals. And really the general idea here is to get deeply familiar with how it looks for you, so that you can better deploy strategies to mitigate it. We're in this component of the framework, we're also looking to develop an awareness of what better could look like for you. So understanding your goals and motivations for improving your career confidence in the first place. That's really important. So moving on, let's look at the second component of the framework, short-term mitigation strategies. So these are techniques that you can employ in the moment to mitigate feelings of imposter syndrome. The key here is that we're looking for constructive techniques. So not things like over preparation or intensive research that are really just those negative impacts of imposter syndrome masquerading as strengths. So one technique I use frequently with my clients and students is mind mapping. So there's no perfect way to do this, but it really just involves, it's as simple as taking a 15-minute timer and a sheet of paper. I always turn it horizontally so that it shifts your brain into thinking differently and more creatively. And then if you're feeling this acute case of imposter syndrome, taking 15 minutes to just get your thoughts out on paper can be really, really calming. So you might start in the center with a prompt like, what's bothering me, right? And literally writing that down in a circle in the center of the paper. And then from there, just jotting down all of the thoughts and ideas and things that come to mind for you. So the key here is to keep your pen moving. So if you get stuck, challenging yourself to dig deeper on what that means. What did you write? When you write down something, like what does that look like for you, or what do you mean by that phrase that you just wrote down? But really challenging yourself to go deeper and really unpack what you're getting out on paper. I want to encourage you to keep pushing yourself and keep writing for 15 minutes. So really just the key here is to keep the pen moving. But after 15 minutes, you'll likely feel a lot calmer and you'll have this map of what's on your brain. And with it all laid out on paper and sort of out of your head, you're in a much better position to start addressing the challenges one by one. And I know this sounds really, really basic, but I really challenge you to just try it, right? So if you do it for 15 minutes and it's just not working for you, then you can get up and walk away and never try it again. But I have probably recommended this strategy to hundreds of people, and almost always they come back to me and they're like, that was a good idea. I didn't believe you, but I'm glad I tried it. So 15 minutes really can make a difference there. Another short-term strategy to mitigate imposter syndrome is to brainstorm a list of things you're worried about, right? So I just actually put up a worksheet about this on my website. It's called What's the Worst That Can Happen? And it walks you through this exercise in more detail. But the idea here is that you literally generate a list of all of the things that you're worried about, right? So what's the worst thing that can happen about whatever situation you're struggling with? And then jotting it down. And then after you've developed this entire list, taking a couple of minutes to think about what you would do in every single situation that you've come up with. These two exercises can be really helpful in terms of this short-term strategy for problem solving, but in a constructive way when imposter syndrome hits. So the third component of the framework is focused on long-term confidence building. So here we're talking about strategies you can use over a longer period to build up your career confidence. This is important because managing imposter syndrome really is a long game. So one of my favorite long-term confidence building strategies is what I call a file of kind words. So this involves collecting evidence of your skills and strengths so that in moments of self-doubt, you have this trove of data to look back on. So kind words can come in many forms. You might save an email from your boss praising your performance on a project, or keep a file on Evernote where you jot down positive feedback that people give you verbally, like right there in the moment. This photo shows a bunch of cards that I've received from students thanking me for career and life guidance that I've given them. I keep every single one, and I always look back on them when I'm having moments of self-doubt and worry about what I'm doing. The format of the kind words isn't as important as maintaining the practice of collecting this sort of thing. So especially taking that time to write down the compliments and kind words that people share with you, because it's an ongoing process, but you'll be deeply grateful that you started doing this when the feelings of imposter syndrome hit, and you can go back and look at the data. Another long-term strategy is to seek out a role model of someone that you feel is really confident, and start observing what it is about their words and behavior and actions that conveys confidence to you. So do this from a place of admiration, of course, right? But try to figure out how they're signaling to you that they are confident. And then when you're ready, you can try adopting some of those behaviors that you notice. So some of the specific actions, right? And when you're nervous, then you can get to this place where you're focusing on channeling your inner Michelle Obama, or your really confident best friend, Kate, or whoever it is that you admire for their poise and confidence. This can really have a huge impact. So the fourth component of the career confidence framework is community building. So as you can see, the other three components of the framework are mostly internally focused. So they center on you and how you can develop awareness of your imposter syndrome and mitigate its effects over the short and the long term. The community building component is an externally focused set of strategies. So the key here, the idea here, is to mitigate your imposter syndrome by lifting others up. So this can take a variety of forms, including being a role model, reaching out if you see someone struggling with confidence. You might find opportunities to help promote others. So especially if you see that someone else is deflecting the praise for their contributions, you might jump in and say, actually, no, Kate totally did that herself, and I'm really excited for that for her. You might also want to share the kind words out. So if you're feeling a really acute case of imposter syndrome, taking a moment there in that moment to write a note to a teacher or someone who's made an impact on you and say, thank you so much for doing this. That can really that's a community building strategy that really can give you a boost of confidence in the moment as well. Okay, so we just covered the four components of this career confidence framework, and obviously this is a really high level overview, but you saw how these four pieces can fit together. So by leveraging the self-awareness and the short-term mitigation strategies and the long-term confidence building and the community building in concert, we have a powerful framework that can dramatically mitigate the effects of imposter syndrome. But before we wrap up, I want to take a moment to ask you to imagine the transformation that you could achieve. So what would better look like for you? What impact would feeling more confident in your career make in your life? I want you to think about all of the different dimensions of your life. So not just the impact that confidence would have on the time you spend in the office, but also to consider how it would affect your mental and physical health, the impact it would have on your finances and social life. Would you have more time to spend on your hobbies or with friends? Would you feel calmer with your partner or your kids? What opportunities would you take advantage of if you were able to better manage the symptoms of imposter syndrome? So take a moment to jot down on your worksheet a few of the different ways that your life would improve if you felt more confident in your career. Okay, so let's review. In today's webinar, we discussed what imposter syndrome is and how it can show up in many, many different forms, including as perfectionism, feeling like you're floating or just going through the motions, or as an inability to take ownership over your success. We talked about some of the reasons why I believe it's so common among smart people, including a lack of awareness of your natural competence, a fear of failure stemming from having an identity built on success, and a lack of meaningful feedback in the workplace. We also went into detail about the challenges of transitioning from academia and mastering material to moving into the workplace and learning from experience. We also talked about some of the ways that imposter syndrome can be negatively affecting you, so including causing you to procrastinate or not take action, to decide not to apply for jobs and other opportunities, instead of letting the committee reject you, and distorting your thinking into seeing each success as a discrete accomplishment instead of realizing that they're all connected. We also talked about how research is the most insidious form of procrastination and how there are some things that can only be learned from experience. We talked about the 4-part career confidence framework, which combines self-awareness with short-term mitigation strategies and long-term confidence building strategies, as well as an outward focus on supporting others to mediate the effects of imposter syndrome. We then wrapped up by spending some time imagining the impact that having more confidence in your career could make in your life. So before we jump into the question and answer session, I just like to encourage you to be sure to visit my website to download the worksheet, as well as other resources that I've created that can help young professionals find more fulfilling work and lives. And of course, if what I shared with you today resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. So kind words and constructive feedback are always welcome. And I always appreciate hearing if what I've shared has been helpful. So thank you so much in advance if you'd like to reach out to me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam to begin the question and answer session.
Awesome. Yeah. So just an invitation for all those joining us. If you haven't yet written your questions in, please go ahead and type them into the questions box now. We do have a couple in already, so we'll start there. First question, have you seen effective ways, Caroline, that organizations have implemented programmatic initiatives to show appreciation for high achievers? And could you talk maybe how that sort of fits into this imposter syndrome issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I love it. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of ways that organizations don't support high achievers, but actually one of the things that I do when I'm not doing the career coaching work is consulting on organizational development strategy. And we've actually put together a program on that companies can bring us in for to help create high performance teams and really increase that communication between people. And there's more information about that elsewhere. But I think one of the most effective strategies that I've seen has been to really build it into the culture of the organization in a really strategic way. So that could look like things like creating space in your weekly meetings to recognize people and really make sure that people are being recognized for personal things that they're contributing to the table. So like literally opening up a meeting each week with kind of sharing the affirmations. When I worked with student leaders, we would literally create these affirmation bags where we would share like notes of affirmation and share those kinds of confidence boosters. I think it really is a role modeling experience where you're sending a note to people when they're doing a good job and really helping people connect that action to outcome, right? So helping them really see the direct connection between their behavior and a really good response. But I think it's definitely something that organizations can really continue to improve on.
Great. We have another question. How can those of us who've had negative impacts socially regarding our success, anything from mocking to exclusion to jealousy, overcome that and our own success?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear that situation has happened. And I know that it can really be a confidence barrier, and I've definitely experienced similar feelings as well. So I'm really sorry for you having been there. I would say that in terms of moving forward, I think it's a daily experience. So really taking the practice of in my view, we notice what we're looking for, right? So if we are in this space of looking for the positives and really, really focusing on finding evidence of our successes and really building up a record of that, I think that can be super helpful. So that could look like literally every single night before you go to bed, making a list of 3 things that you've done today that you're really, really proud of. Or really try, because if you're finding like negative external support, then really focusing it on yourself and what you can bring to the table and the kinds of feelings that you want to have. It could also look like literally writing down a list of like, this is how I want to feel, and reviewing that on a daily basis. I mean, that sounds a bit cheesy, but it really does work, because you're constantly reminding yourself of how you want to feel, and re-choosing that on a daily basis. But I've really found that those 3 things you're proud of on a daily basis can really be a great proxy for those kind words until those kind words are rolling in.
We have another attendee who's interested in hearing a bit more about your path, Caroline. They write, starting your own company is a move that I imagine must have required a lot of confidence. What was your thought process as you were deciding to move away from working for universities, and how did you know that it was time?
I think that's a great question. Well, I think that I had basically what happened was I have been teaching these classes on leadership and social entrepreneurship for years at Johns Hopkins, and then eventually got sick of myself, sick of hearing myself say, but I could never start a business. And I kind of got to the point where I was like, well, why not? Like, why couldn't I start a business? I teach other people how to start businesses all the time. And I realized how silly that was. And I basically decided to jump and make it happen. I got married last year, so I have health insurance, and that was really a big confidence booster. But the really cool thing that happened was that as soon as I put it out into the universe that this is what I was doing, and I sent notes to people and said, like, I'm starting a career coaching business, before I even had a website up or anything, I actually had former students email me back and say, okay, well, where do I sign up? Like, how do I get started? And that was really, really helpful, right? So that was a huge boost of confidence, and actually really helped me feel a lot better about where I was going from here. So I decided that I realized that my impact could be broader if I expanded my reach beyond Baltimore. And I also really feel like there are some really big challenges of the university culture that I'm just not going to be able to fix by myself, but I can really support people once they get out of the institution to feel more confident on the back end.
Great. We have another question that is getting at that point that you made about kind of deflecting praise. And so we have a question: do you have advice for getting along with workmates while not undercutting one's own accomplishment? So I think, speaking to a tendency that, if we deflect praise, sometimes it's in an effort to recognize others and sort of be collegial. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I've seen situations where people are really negative in the workplace. I mean, I think it's actually a great problem to have where people are feeling like really, really collegial, but kind of making the space to so everybody receives praise in different ways. Some people are really not good at receiving praise verbally, and that's totally fine. I had a staff member who was that was just not her strength. But learning how people receive praise can be really helpful so that you can tailor your message to their preferred mode of communication. So there's so that you can, so sometimes it might look like verbal praise. Sometimes it might look like written words. Sometimes it might look like, a little like gift or something, or like an act of service is what it can sometimes be called, where you do something nice for someone else as a way of affirming their contributions. But I think that if we can move to this place where people are feeling like it's perfectly fine in a meeting to say, yeah, thank you, I appreciate the feedback, and then just move on. Like, you don't have to, it's not just either ignoring it or, waxing poetic about how appreciative you are. Like, you can just acknowledge it and then move on with your life and make that note in Evernote later.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question. And thank you everyone for your questions. And sorry that we are running short of time here. Our last question, I have a sense that my former accomplishments are what allow me access to future accomplishments. How do I know that I'm qualified based on who I am now instead of who I was when I won awards?
Oh, I think that's a really good, I said this for everyone, but I mean, I think that that's a really interesting question, right? Because your success is cumulative, right? Like, and failure is just like a temporary roadblock because you're just learning how to negotiate the next sort of obstacle in your course. But I I think that's a really interesting idea that, you are, like, all of these other contributions have contributed to who you are now, and that you're able to, you're only ever getting better, right? Because you're able to pull information and synthesize information across all kinds of different experiences, and you're approaching you're never the same person approaching the next experience. And I see this a lot on the flip side with people who really regret something that they did in the past, where they look back and they're like, I should have done that differently, and they kind of beat themselves up over not having had the right answer at the beginning. But the key is that, like, even if you were to do that experience again, you're not the same person that you were the last time, and you're just bringing different things to the table. And so it can be real, it's not helpful, right? And that, I think, goes for all of these things. If you're grappling with one of these emotions, taking a moment to stop and ask yourself, is this even helpful to me? Like, is having this emotion helpful for me? Because if it's not, then it's your choice to not engage with it, right? So you can decide that, like, that's not helpful. It's not helpful for me to have that, and I'm going to redirect my attention elsewhere.
Great. Well, as I mentioned, we're running at the end of our hour. I know we had just a couple of questions that we didn't get to. Caroline, would you be comfortable fielding those questions offline if that one or two people reach out to you?
Sure. And I think that in my in the follow-up email, there's a link with my email address as well. So feel free to email me, and I would be glad to get back to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Thank you, Caroline, for sharing these tips on overcoming imposter syndrome. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'll be back Thursday of next week, February 20th at 12 p.m. Central Time, with a webinar titled The Transformative Power of Job Crafting. Join us and learn a self-driven process for reimagining your professional role in a way that better reflects your values, strengths, and skills. You can visit our events page at careers.uchicagoalumni.org for a list of our upcoming programs. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Caroline.
No problem. Thank you.